I love games, but every once in a while a game comes along that I form such a strong emotional connection to that it makes me question whether I even like other games. It makes me feel like games that I know are amazing are actually just average. When I was 11, it was a commie. When I was 13, it was Dragon Quest VIII. Last year, it was Persona 5. And this year, it was undoubtedly Disco Elysium. I'm all about gameplay before story. My favourite games are all focused around letting me get to the action and telling a story in a way that's effective and unobtrusive. And what you'll realise about all the games I listed is that they're the complete opposite of that. They're mostly long as fuck RPGs where you're reading walls of text for literal hours, and that's because when a story is done right and it hooks me, I can't let go. Thinking about Disco Elysium now, the day after I've finished it, gives me a hollow feeling in my stomach. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since I first played it almost exactly 2 months ago. To describe to someone who didn't know what it was, I'd call it a tabletop RPG-inspired detective game, and I'd say it was probably most comparable to a very intricate and well-written choose-your-own-adventure book. This game isn't for everyone and is mostly just reading, but if you're in any way interested by that description or the footage you've seen so far, I'm going to give you the warning that anyone who likes this game is sure to endorse, and that is to stop watching right now and come back after you've played it. There are at least 2 videos I myself have put off watching for over a year, and I'm so happy I went in blind as a bat. I was going to say I didn't plan on spoiling anything major, but then I realised that's total bullshit because learning even the most basic things or passing innocuous skill checks can sometimes have the most profound outcomes. There are so many tiny details to discover that seem completely normal after you've played the game, but when you start you really don't have a fucking clue about anything. I feel very lucky that this game isn't more popular and I was able to go in so obliviously. It really added to the immersion of the experience. You couldn't pay me £1 million to go back in time and have the experience relayed to me through a YouTube video. Like your first kiss, or the first time you listen to Darkside, some experiences are just priceless. Now that's out of the way, let's get down to business. Disco Elysium is one of the most well-written, well-realised, thought-provoking and lovable pieces of fiction ever created, period. Not just in video games, not just in RPGs, but also including books, cinema, and everything else. The choice to make the player character a complete retrograde amnesiac fits the way the game presents itself perfectly. In most games you're a person that already exists, and therefore your character is either a blank slate with a meaningless past to allow you to attempt to roleplay, or a fully realised person with their own personality and life who can't roleplay at all without completely breaking the consistency of their character. In Disco Elysium, you are both. You have a past, clearly a traumatic one, but you also can't remember anything about yourself or your political views or even your own name. I know what it is, but I haven't said it yet. If I was talking about any other game, you'd know the main character was Link or Kratos before I'd even finished the title. But in Disco Elysium, you can quite conceivably go days without learning your name. Something which can be hilarious when you're trying to assert your authority as a police officer, and Kim just has to call you his partner. Turns out, it's Tequila Sunset. The amnesia is frequently played for laughs like this, and allows you to ask all sorts of stupid questions about what money is or where you left your badge. More importantly though, as I alluded to before, the amnesia allows you to roleplay. Because at the beginning of the game, the most you can figure out about yourself is that you're a drunken idiot detective that likes disco and may or may not want to stop existing. You can choose to react to situations in many different ways, and still have it fit the narrative. You can be the sorriest cop on earth and try to repent for your abhorrent behaviour. You can continue to be a drunken asshole to everyone you meet. You can be an absolutely giant communist, or you can be a ruthless ultra-liberal. Every playstyle is as valid to the narrative as any other. For me though, the most important part of the Amnesia is its effect on the world building. The world building of Disco Elysium is absolutely perfect from the opening segment of the game. The moment you hear the sound of that Kinema engine, you know it's going to be a great time. I'm not sure if it's because I favoured intelligence in my build, but I feel like going from knowing fuck all about the world I was in to reading thousands of little snippets of details through passive skill checks was such an insane experience. The world is so realistic and so similar to ours, you start to feel like it might just be a fictional country. But then you look at Kim's car or get a snippet about the moral intern, and the lines between realism and fiction start to blur. I knew it was awesome straight away, but there was one specific moment when I truly grasped the scope of the world I was playing in. The moment came when I was exploring the abandoned offices of the doomed commercial area and found the failed game studio making a game called Wirral Untethered. Wirral Untethered is a ridiculously ambitious radio-based tabletop RPG which you learn about by reading this chalkboard followed by these markings on the chimney. At first you have absolutely no idea what it is. You see drawings of creatures known as Welkins, the Disco Elysium equivalent of elves. You know what? I'll just let the game do the talking here.
Translucent Welkins, with organs shining under their skin, and even ether Welkins, hailing from the vast emptiness of sidereal space. You should adopt one of those Welkins as your persona. No longer a mere man, but a Welkin. One of the Welkins, towering among the rest, appears to be different, however. It's Vara Hamira, a high Welkin, his face white and scarred like cracked marble. This is clearly a Welkin supremacist. The note says, all non-Welkin races will be purged. The Haldor, the Tworg, the humans, and even headless men, all of them, purged. Imagine a world filled only with Welkin, Green Welkin, Dread Welkin, and the High Welkin to rule them all.
An inordinate amount of time has gone into drawing these little Welkin creatures.
The photo collage depicts barren, icy landscapes wrapped in perpetual night. You see permafrost and glacial landforms, dead trees grown in under the snow. Entire oceans have been frozen from shore to shore. There are pictures of settlements on dried-up riverbeds, abandoned in a storm. Animal corpses in the dark, carcasses and bones. You see primitive oil rigs built into glaciers, boreal dvorg, yurts under the snow, great mammoth-like beasts of burden. Albeit dark and cold, this vision also feels cozy in its own way, like eggnog or morphine, a much-needed respite from our own world. A pinned postcard reads, "The heat death scenario, a desperate fight for geothermal energy engulfs the world as Wirral becomes untethered from its sun, drifting through the universe."
Now tell me you don't want to play that game. Holy shit, man. It's about magical supremacist elves trying to wipe out all other races to a backdrop of the heat death of a planet. If that's not one of the best fucking ideas for a game, I don't know what is. But that's not all. When you inspect the fireplace drawings, you find out that it's a massive, and I mean massive, radio-controlled tabletop RPG. It's a call-in radio station made up of smaller groups of role players with a game master frequency that can listen in on all the other smaller frequencies and coordinate them. Its real-world equivalent would probably be lots of Zoom D&D games all within the same world, all being coordinated at a much higher level by a games master. Or a multiplayer online audio-only Disco Elysium style game in a fantasy setting ran by a real person. Just to clarify, They don't have computer screens in Disco Elysium, but they do have radio computers. It's a project that was bound to fail, but an insanely cool one nonetheless. In the words of Kim,
It's as if the less money they had, the more ambitious their project became.
Afterwards, Kim will clarify all of this with you, and also tell you it's based on a modified version of an existing tabletop RPG called Wirral with heat death thrown in. So essentially, they tried to make a massive multiplayer online tabletop role-playing game, where the world had fallen from the gravitational pull of its sun. Now what you'll notice here is that I have been discussing the world building of a game based on a tabletop RPG within a game based on a tabletop RPG, and this is when it hit me. If I can be so interested in a game within a game to the point where I actually want that game to exist, to the point where I forget that Wirral Untethered wasn't a real failed game and was just made up by the writers of Disco Elysium for a relatively small portion of their game, Disco Elysium itself had to be a masterpiece. It's like this all the way through, and it absolutely takes the Tolkien approach to world building. Every single fucking thing in the game is realised and discussed in such minute detail, in such a realistic way as if it actually existed. Arno van Eyck, Rue du Saint Ghislain, Dolores fucking Day and her shiny fucking lungs. The details are so ingrained in my memory I feel like I've read a Wikipedia article about them. Except it's not like that. It's like Wirral Untethered, where you start off knowing fucking nothing, and slowly your picture about each thing builds as you gather tiny snippets of information from the various people you speak to, exactly how you would in real life, until you kind of have a pretty decent grasp on where you are and what things are. As I mentioned earlier, one of my favourite things about the world building is the line it walks between our reality and the world of fiction. A lot of the details are exactly the same. Electricity, the telephone, radio, and even pinball machines all exist within Revachol. But so many things are different. The cars are functionally the same, but the ones we see are weird 1920s style hot rods. Guns exist, but automatic weapons have been banned for almost 40 years in the wake of the revolution, and so the pistols in use by the police are front-loading powder and ball style, like something from over 100 years ago, and anything else kicking around is either older than the revolution or military hardware. There's clearly something different about Revachol, but it's so close to home that it's hard to see where to adjust your expectations on what's going to happen. When you step into Skyrim and get attacked by a dragon in the first 5 minutes, you're completely mentally prepared to fight walking skeletons and shoot fireballs out of your hands. But waking up in a place like Martinez with amnesia makes it hard to tell whether you should believe in magic or not. Not knowing where you stand is both unsettling and extremely exciting, especially in terms of Disco Elysium being a detective game. Most noir films and stories take place on Earth at some time or place. Even fantastically sci-fi stories like Blade Runner tend to obey the laws of physics, but in Disco Elysium you're cut adrift from all of that. In most stories, the murderer is usually motivated by love or politics, but trying to figure out the story of the hanged man in a world where you don't know if magic and ghosts and other creepy paranormal shit exists is so less straightforward. The game absolutely leans into this style as much as it can and is constantly flirting with the paranormal. Your inner thoughts are always trying to convince you of some mad conclusion that no sane person would jump to in the real world. But in a world of video games where anything can exist and happen, it could really be the truth. As much as it feels wrong to make wild claims about the existence of malignant entities and curses inhabiting Martinez, I'm conditioned to think that type of thing is believable in video games and fiction generally. At one point, I was convinced that I was involved in the murder. It would be a perfect twist to set up with the amnesia in play, and the game even let me ask the question, even though it was well documented that I only turned up in Martinez 4 days after the hanging, and if I had 2 brain cells to rub together I would have realised that before I asked the question. You get so turned around by all the mystery and amnesia and lying that at one point I was convinced that Kim was the murderer and he'd pulled the perfect crime by being able to investigate it. It would have been a crazy twist, but I'm sorry I ever doubted you, Kim. My earliest and strongest idea about Revachol is that it didn't really exist at all. Harrier was dead and Revachol was his hell, or purgatory. Basically, I figured it was something like that one episode of Futurama where Leela keeps eating the honey, or the idea that is vaguely hinted towards in the insane waking life. The "it was all a dream" is an extremely common twist, and the game hints at it a lot. It almost goads you into thinking it. I mean, even if it's not the case, in some ways Martinez really is hell on earth. It turns out all these ideas were false, even if the game did kind of lead me into them. But the constant setting up and then breaking of these ridiculous ideas makes you think that maybe everything in Revachol is how it is in the real world. Things might be different, but maybe everything else there is pretty much normal. Magic doesn't work. There aren't any weird happenings and spooky occurrences. The creepy crab man, who really is more like a Spider-Man, turns out just to be an avid climber. The cryptid hunt turns out to be nothing, and the cursed commercial building just housed idiotic companies that got kids to eat ice cream out of a giant predator. As much as the game wants you to toy with the idea of the fantastic, it really is just normal. But all this normality does is make the truly insane aspects of the game hit that much harder. Harrier talks to dead bodies and inanimate objects, and has 24 different personality traits vying for attention in his head. It is so easy to pass this off as Raphael being a fucking basket case, but the reality is sometimes these dead bodies and thoughts tell Harry knowledge that he has absolutely no other way of knowing. The best fucked up thing I learned about in the game was absolutely the Pale. At this point, I was convinced that Revachol was an otherwise normal fictional city, and then I go to Joyce to learn about reality, and she tells me all about Revachol and the Revolution and Wild Pines and the Union, and well, I think I'll let the game do the talking again.
The Pale is the most dominant geological feature of the world, Detective. The separative tissue between the islas. It is the inter-islary mass. Achromatic, odorless, featureless. The Pale is the enemy of matter and life. It is not like any other, or anything in the world. It is the transition state of being into nothingness.
The negation of being.
That's right. The negation of being.
I was expecting it the entire time after I read about Wirral Untethered, but even being prepared for my mind to be blown didn't stop the Pale from absolutely fucking my head up. In the world of Disco Elysium, the world is covered in a grey fog of antimatter that separates the continents and causes all sorts of insane phenomena. Mathematics, physics, and even history are bent and twisted by the Pale, and long exposure to it can turn people into a catatonic state. The top scientists of the time don't even know what it is, and they don't even know what their world looks like because of it. And it's growing. The Pale is such a fucking crazy topic, and I instantly knew it was the real deal, because everyone talks about what is essentially 2/3 of the world being a fog of unreality like it's gravity or water. It just exists. Kim realizes how messed up it would sound to someone with complete amnesia, and even tries to stop you from asking about it. In fact, he won't even let you discuss it whilst he's nearby. He's trying his best to protect you from the more crazy aspects of the world you've just woken up in. The characters inhabiting Martinez are some of the most unique and memorable in any writing, Each one has a distinct personality and something to say about the world they inhabit. Almost every one can be talked to at length and has some quest associated with them. In most RPGs, NPCs seem to be so two-dimensional. They're either a guard or a shopkeeper, and that's all there is to them. But the writing of Disco Elysium is so genuine that each character feels so at home in this ruin of a place to live. You have the cryptozoologist and his wife, whose relationship is built around her experience seeing a cryptid as a child that clearly doesn't exist, and her sorrow as that realization slowly dawns on her. Working with them is the crypto-fascist Gary, who was the final and lucky racist in the trio of racists. The first being a fat drunken piece of shit, and the second being a highly intelligent but still delusional 7-foot-tall phrenologist called Measurehead, who speaks in all capitals and is one of the funniest characters in the game.
You understand nothing. To solve the great race enigma, you have to first ask yourself, what is the race enigma?
Every character in the game has this deep, personal, and usually hilarious characterization, but some of the standouts for me are Egghead, the anodic music lover, who just turned up one day and does nothing but shout, "Hardcore!" and other variations on the phrase, and the novelty dice maker, a lovely lady who has failed and still kept going, and seems perfectly content with the way her life turned out. Her little studio up in the chimney of the doomed commercial building, towering above all the madness, is one of the nicest locations in the game, and it houses one of the nicest residents. And then we come to Kim. Kim Kitsuragi is one of the most likable and authentic video game characters ever to exist. I feel like I rarely have such an emotional connection and get as attached to a character as I did to Kim. Unlike the other characters in the game, who frequently have quite extreme personalities and could almost be caricatures, Kim is 100% understated subtlety. Everything about his character makes him seem like a real person. He seems almost like a neutral blank slate when we meet him, but that's just because he's a professional, and the more we get to know him, the more he opens up. As with everything about Disco Elysium, it's all about the details, and Kim becomes so well fleshed out over the course of the entire game. He's one of the best detectives in the RCM, and so it's so endearing when he suddenly becomes as interested as us in some crazy side story that has nothing to do with the case, or when he pawns his mad rims to pay our debt. He has so many subtle facets to his personality that he doesn't shout to the world but come out in small quiet moments, like when he prays to Dolores Day, his single daily cigarette, or the fact he wears a revolutionary jacket and dreamed of being a fighter pilot as a kid. Kim also always has your back, and the relationship that grows between you is so heartwarming. Even though you act like an insane person chasing after every minute lead, he is the first person to stand up for you in every scenario. One of the most intense skill checks in the game has the modifier that reads, +1, the lieutenant trusts you. +2, Kim truly trusts you. And it's obvious to see why. Being rewarded for being best friends with Kim and saving his life because of it made me feel so happy. Half the time I said the most normal dialogue options just because I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of Kim. In a similar vein, when I had to let Kim take the body away one night and he didn't come back for a few hours, I felt so alone. Like, even though I had all the same tasks and could do all the same things, I felt lost without his support and guidance. At the end of the day, Disco Elysium isn't really your classic noir detective story. It's also a buddy cop story. I mean, his art even has a halo around it. What else did I expect? The art in general is absolutely breathtaking in this game. Even though the character interactions are mostly static, all the colour and variety in the different character portraits make the interactions come alive. The visual direction and composition in each one makes them all feel like distinct pieces of art, rather than just an image of each character. I especially love the motif of the Union, with the orange and white blocks being reminiscent of their room in the whirling. Titus has the clearest background to show his leadership, and the rest of the Hardy Boys are pretty similar. Elizabeth's is almost unrecognisable to indicate the changes she has went through getting her law degree. Measurehead even has the same motif, although splashed with the colour from his face. And Evart Clare's is turned completely upside down to represent his power and corruption. God, I sound like a fucking art cop. Even the streets of Martinez, though grim and depressing, are filled with subdued blues and oranges and greens that just make everything look beautiful. I've been using the artwork as one of my desktop backgrounds since before I'd even played the game. I've been describing Disco Elysium to the people I talk to as a proper RPG, and clearly what I mean by that is that it's tabletop inspired. But more accurately, what I mean by that is that the game is less focused on hours and hours of turn-based combat against the same enemies, and more focused on role-playing. I don't think I've ever played a game anywhere near Disco Elysium where it comes to feeling like every single dialogue option and choice I make in the game actually matters. In most RPGs, I'll just ask every question in a dialogue list for the sake of getting as much information as possible. In Disco Elysium, where the whole point of the game is to gather information, I would frequently not say certain dialogue options because I felt I didn't want to upset the characters, or they were in poor taste, or I just felt the Harry I wanted to be wouldn't say those things. I don't know how this game is coded, but it's a marvel of game making in and of itself. The ability of the game to remember tiny bits of dialogue choices you made hours earlier, and bits of information you only got from a passive skill check, and then bring them into conversations across the entire story is astounding. Even though I knew there had to be smoke and mirrors somewhere in the equation, I was absolutely blown away by the level of depth and detail that every conversation affords you, and how could I have had half the conversations I did have if I hadn't completed completely optional tasks earlier? Like, how do you interact with Suna at all unless you've investigated the Wirral Untethered office first? I read somewhere while writing this that they recorded over 1 million words of dialogue for the final cut, which is comparable to the same as every single book in the main Harry Potter series put together. I get that a lot of those lines will be variations based on the choices you've made, but that itself is a testament to the work put into making you feel like your actions actually matter. I never once felt railroaded by the game, and yet at the same time I somehow managed to get through the story perfectly in keeping with how the game wanted me to. I felt like all my choices were my own and all their outcomes were unique to me, and yet I still ended up having the experience I was supposed to. It felt insane to think what kind of other paths you could experience, because I had no idea how someone doing completely different things, like not getting the body down and not passing certain skill checks, could end up with the same leads as me. To give an example of my own playthrough, I failed a skill check to get the tie from the ceiling, and for some reason refused to level anything up for ages, instead spending all my skill points on thought cabinet slots, which I found more interesting, and so the tie just sat there for the first 4 days of the game. I also didn't choose a political alignment at all, and so missed the extra quest added to the final cut, and I didn't pass the skill check with the shipping container, and so didn't meet the ultra-rich lightbender at all. There's such a wealth of options to partake in and miss out on, that even though I've had a certain experience of the game, it could be completely different from yours. I've only played through it once, and I don't know every choice and every dialogue option, so half of what I'm saying could be wrong because I don't have enough information, and the other half could be completely unique to me. Even though gameplay-wise you're just standing around reading and listening to text on the screen for most of the game, the feeling that each choice matters and the quality of the writing makes the entire experience so personal and dramatic. Every single conversation felt like it had the same weight and intensity that combat does in a regular game, and in some cases more so. I constantly felt like I needed to get the right information and ask the right questions and say the right things at all times to get just a little bit closer to solving the mystery once and for all, even if it was only the mystery of who I was. I fail to think of a time in a game that seems to be as rewarding as passing a skill check in Disco Elysium. Every single time the dice rolled, I would catch myself holding my breath waiting for that little splash of green or red to appear on the screen. But even this paled in comparison to the tension brought about by action in this game. Most of the game is just walking around and talking to people, but the beauty of this is that it just makes the violence that is within the game have a much larger and much more meaningful impact when it does occur. In many games, you shoot thousands of bullets over the course of your time like it's nothing. In Disco Elysium, I shot one bullet at a piece of cable, and it was more exciting and more memorable than almost any other time I can think of using a gun in a game. The tension building up to what is clearly about to happen, taking time to ready myself, and finally passing that dice roll made the bang of the gun that much louder as it rang out across all of Martinez. Taken to its extreme, this makes the climax of the game one of the most tense and thrilling experiences I've ever had. The mercenary tribunal starts as you make your way back to the Whirling in Rags, and holy shit does that soundtrack get you hyped as fuck. With the case unsolved, with basically still no fucking idea what's going on, you and Kim have to try your hardest to defend yourselves and Martinez from 3 mercenaries fully clad in the ceramic armour and armed with automatic weapons and in one case an anti-tank rifle. I tried to talk these drunk mercenary bastards down, but they just wouldn't have it, and I knew I had to make that red skill check and take the shot. I was literally watching a dice roll on screen while I picked dialogue options, but my heart was in my mouth the entire time. Trying to save Martinez and keep Kim and the rest of the Hardy Boys alive felt so important to me because they are written so realistically. I felt the entire weight of trying to prevent a full-scale massacre committed by these drunken mass murderers on the streets of Revachol on my shoulders. It felt like a new revolution was about to break out there and then. The stakes really felt that high, and it's basically an Old West cowboy shootout with the music to match. I was 100% convinced I was about to die. Passing a skill check is a tense moment, but when it comes down to it, you don't really have any outside input and the outcome is left to fate. But when the rolls are all passive skill checks, it's all reward and no downside. The endless incessant passive skill checks that let the voices in my head tell me insane details about the situation were perhaps my favourite part of the game. In most role-playing games, picking intelligence over strength just means that you'll kill enemies with magic instead of two-handed swords. But in Disco Elysium, it actually affects how the game world presents itself. I chose a pretty balanced character with a bias towards logic because I'm a detective, and holy shit it was a lot of fun. Having logic chime in and help put together the little pieces was perfect, and the fact that the information you get changes based on your skills made me feel even more so like my playthrough was individual to me. It's a proper role-playing game. I remember learning during the mercenary tribunal that the scab leader was the hanged man's brother based on his second name, which I thought was a pretty great revelation, but I learned while doing some research for this script that they were actually foster brothers. I knew the hanged man was raised in a foster home because of the background check I did, but I didn't have enough empathy to put 2 and 2 together when I actually played the game. Looking that up, I just can't help think about what little details have slipped through the cracks. I think my favourite passive skill in the entire game ended up being Shivers. You feel the city in your veins, and it quite often gives you very specific but vaguely written insights into important topics that are extremely relevant to the investigation, but are also happening halfway across Martinaise and have absolutely nothing to do with the conversation you're part of at that moment. It felt amazing to wonder what those little bits meant and then come across their meaning later in the game. Unlike the rest of the skills which give you insights that are relevant at the moment you think them, Shivers is so good. At one point the city itself sang a DMX reference to me.
Have a brother in a cut. Where the hood at?
What the fuck? Discussing different ideas about politics and religion and philosophy in real life very often leads to messily thought out, emotionally charged arguments where both sides have a terrible confirmation bias and ends with people taking it way too seriously and getting their feelings hurt. If you've ever seen people argue or talk about politics on the internet, you'll know what I mean. This leads to most people's opinions being formed in echo chambers, where one idea is crowned king, and any differing thoughts are instantly shouted down by the majority. It seems almost impossible to have a frank discussion about any serious topic without it quickly descending into chaos. It doesn't help that people are typically less like Joyce and Kim, and more like Gary the crypto-fascist. In contrast, the world of Disco Elysium presents its differing ideas in such a direct and honest manner that you are more of an interviewer asking someone's opinion rather than someone who's part of a debate. There isn't really a bad guy in the world, and there isn't one accepted correct view presented. You are free to consider the different parts of the moral, philosophical and political spectrum as you wish, and agree with or disagree with whoever you want in a non-argumentative way. You're basically listening to a lot of people with very strong opinions voice their side of a story and deciding how you feel about what they have to say. The Union just wants rights for the working class, but their leader Evert Clare is a corrupt bastard. In a similar way, the Wild Pines are just trying to keep their business running smoothly, but they sent in ruthless killer mercenaries to solve the situation for them. The communists just want freedom for Revachol, but their method for achieving it is war, and the moral intern just want to keep the peace, but they end up oppressing an entire nation through foreign occupation, and they measure progress in centuries. There is no right answer, and Disco Elysium is a journey in discovering as much about yourself and how you see the world as it is about solving a murder. There's a reason the final scene is a test based on the choices you made in the game, and not about who killed the hanged man. I think this video is an extremely roundabout way of showing how and why I became so emotionally invested in this video game. A game where you're standing still reading almost the entire time made me feel more immersed using excellent writing, art and voice work than hundreds of other titles that use high-budget motion facial capture and crazy detailed 3D models and animations. It drew me into its world and kept me there while it made me think about science, religion, art, music, politics, and above all, love. Every aspect I absorbed into my brain, and I was constantly thinking over the different ideas it presents and how it fits together. Not just in Revachol, but how it reflects back on our world. I will never forget Martinaise or the stories of the people that live there. Dancing with Kim made me almost cry with laughter. Making it through the mercenary tribunal made me shout with joy. And the scene with Dolores Day was so heart-wrenchingly real that it almost broke me completely. I want Harry to get better, and get over his ex and be a better man. I want things to be better for everyone living in Martinaise in the shadow of the failed revolution. And I want to keep doing the Jamrock Shuffle. Thank you to everyone at ZAUM, and I mean everyone, for making me attached to a game in a way that I didn't think was possible. Thank you to Kim for always having my back, and thank you for watching. Reva Shawl forever.